dots, the two dots here. But if I'm not mistaken, we didn't start. Very briefly, I mean, he asked several questions, as we explained, where the gist of it is that he wants to perplex you so that it becomes apparent how understanding the categorizations of Chazal, of the different characters of the tzaddik, the rasha, and the Beinoni, isn't sufficient if you try to measure it only in a superficial manner, or even in the commonly used manner, the way that we tend to approach these things, which is more the behavioral scale. And if you only try to measure these categories that way, then there would be all sorts of seeming contradictions, which we explained in the beginning of the chapter. That being said, as we said in the previous chapter, in the previous classes, then he now goes to say that really, in order to answer all these questions and actually explain the meaning of these characters more correctly, we have to deepen our understanding of the topic and see how Chazal, when they categorized people by being one of a tzaddik or a rasha or a Beinoni, they were actually referring to a much deeper or much less behavioral measurement. And therefore, in order for us to understand their categories, we need ourselves to deepen our understanding of a person's, how we measure a person, how we measure ourselves. And by doing so, then in the next batch of chapters, we'll be able to present the characters more correctly. The basis of the whole explanation is the first sentence here. Now that I mentioned, I think we did read the very beginning here. That we said that the very beginning starts by just stating that there are two souls, nefesh elokit and nefesh behemit. That every person is conjured up of two sides, whereas the next 8 or 9 chapters are all an elaboration of these two different souls. So the statement is right here. I don't recall now exactly which part of this we studied. I think we did start the introductions here, but I don't remember exactly which ones we said. I'll just mention 2 general things. First of all, there's the order of how things are presented. Starts by presenting the essence of the animal soul here, which is what we're about to study right now. Then he, in chapter 2, will go to discuss the godly soul. He'll discuss here the essence of the animal soul. Each soul here is categorized into 3 layers. Essence, koiches hanefesh, which is the attributes, and garments. That's what comes of it. I mean, you could categorize in many other ways. There are different texts in Chassidus where it's categorized differently. But here, the Alter Rebbe and this is very basic. This is a very a reasonable way to categorize things. He very, very obviously explains 3 different layers. And the order he explains in, the order in itself is interesting. He doesn't do one soul and then the other completely. And he also doesn't do layers from side to side. Like he doesn't do first the essence of each soul and then the attributes of each soul. He starts by the essence of the animal soul. Then he goes to the essence of the godly soul. He does the attributes and the garments of the godly soul. He does the whole godly soul. And then he goes back to the attributes and the garments of the animal soul. An interesting order of how it unfolds. If I were to translate that into like a psychological experience, then that would be typically the outfold of a tzaddik. So it's an interesting insight that the order he explains the souls is typically the experiential order of an incomplete tzaddik. I'll explain that again, saying that there's the essence of the animal soul, but immediately in two words. What's the essence of the animal soul and the essence of the godly soul? Very simple. The essence of the animal soul is not Hashem, just self, sense of self, yeah, a sense of being a self in its most seminal form. And I think this point we did discuss already in one of the classes. This is maybe the most important point of understanding in all of the Alter Rebbe's. If I'm not mistaken, in one of our last classes, we discussed the very idea of phrase or the semantics of you discussing souls as opposed to inclinations. If I'm not mistaken, that was one of the classes, which is again a very prominent, obvious point that especially if you're studying Tanya, if you've studied many other books, or when the Alter Rebbe wrote Tanya, the Jewish literature background he was writing to. So saying this, presenting a person's duality as the combat between two souls is it's not a typical way of presenting things. The typical semantics are two inclinations, as we know, Yetzer HaTov, Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, the good inclination. Now, last week when we discussed this, so we spoke about how that point itself is very important. That by stressing there being two souls and not stressing two inclinations, the Alter Rebbe wants to make clear that there is a much more existential debate or existential combat going on in a Jew's life. That it's not just a question of which part of myself I allow to come into actualization. The main point, which not just which part of myself, but who is being presented here? Is it me or Hashem? That's the void, or the nekuda, maybe the most important nekuda of the difference in approaches between discussing souls or inclinations. So much so, if I recall, and this is how we concluded last class, that in such a from such a viewpoint, then the assumption to categorize things as inclinations, that tendency itself is Yetzer Hara, because the second I start thinking of inclinations, I am actually already admitting to myself being myself. And now it's just a question. All that's left is which part of myself am I going to bring into reality? But that I am who I am, and that my ego, if you would, is the center point that my life evolves around. So that's not even debatable. Viewing things that way, that itself is a Yetzer Hara, as we discussed last week, if I'm not mistaken, 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. Now, okay, so that's called, that topic, we'd call that the essence of the animals.
May I leave it, please? It's too late.
What I mean by essence of the animal soul, again, this is what is the essence of the animal soul? It's just a sense of self. As we'll see when we go on in the next chapters, from that point, that center essential point, the attributes and garments of each soul are only a development or an expression of that essential point. So anything that expresses me as an individual separate entity from Hashem, that's all klipa, and all of my animal soul structure essentially is an expression of that individual, independent, severed or disconnected from Hashem's self. That sense of being in of myself, existing from of myself. Like we'll read today, he says that the animal soul is derived or made up of the four elements of nature. What's the simple pshat? That the existence of self is a sensation of that my reality exists in of itself. That's the simple meaning of nature. that something is because it is. I don't sense, I don't have awareness of being a result of any cause. I only feel my reality as being, and that is the starting point of my existence. So that sensation, if I say it psychologically more than biologically, so that is the definition of an ego, that a person just feels himself as being. That I am. That isness, and that's the word in Hasidus. I assume most of you are familiar with the word for ego in Hasidus. When you say ego, so it's a much more elaborate word. But the word for ego, the core, the essential words for the core of your ego in Hebrew is yeshus, which just means isness. It's a sense of being. It's not even, you say ego is like an elaborate pride or image of self. It's like a whole makeup, bunch of cosmetics on the core of existence. But just the core experience of existence is, I mean, again, the word in Hebrew is isness, yeshut. You say ego in Hebrew, the word you use is yeshut, which means being, your sense of being. So in the most, obviously, the most existential layer of creation, we feel this way. This is what it means to be created. That's why very often the animal soul in Hasidus is also called the natural soul, because this is the most natural experience. Now, as we'll see in the next chapters, the attributes and the garments of the animal soul are all an elaboration or expression of this basic isness, this basic sense of being, as opposed to the animal soul being a sense of self. So the godly soul is the exact opposite. It's Hashem's, it's a Kadosh Baruch Hu's sense of self. It's his being in the most, again, seminal meaning. So as we'll see when we get to chapter 2, relatively to the animal soul, the most important word for that would be bittul, but we'll get to that when we get to that. So again, this is just, again, to explain what I said, that every soul he divides into three. And the first division is the animal soul being the essence of the animal soul. And the essence is just the isness we discussed last time. Because that's what he discussed in chapter 1. Chapter 2, I'll go back to the isness of the godly soul. So I was starting to say that order that we're going to see is an interesting order. Because again, if I translate this like I started to say, if I translate this experientially, then if I were to contemplate on experiencing these two souls that way, that there's only the point of existence, the essence of the animal soul, but immediately I experience my Hashem's presence, and my attributes, my mind and heart are filled with Hashem's presence, and all my garments are expressing Hashem's presence. So that would be a tzaddik. Again, if my animal soul, my individual existence was only like a fleeting moment of awareness of self in the background of my consciousness, and then HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence would fill my entire attributes and garments, like my sense of self wouldn't erupt into my attributes. I wouldn't be involved in it, and I wouldn't express it at all. That would be a tzaddik. So the order of the chapters here is an interesting order, that he starts with the essence of the animal soul, but he immediately goes to the essence of the godly soul and the attributes and the garments of the godly soul. And then at the end, he goes back to the animal soul. So I'm just pointing that out. That who is this character who lives that way? It's a question. It strengthens what we want to say always when we study Tanya, that really the Alter Rebbe wants everybody to serve Hashem like a complete tzaddik. Also, what he, throughout the book, takes a lot of time and effort to explain that you're not a tzaddik, and halavai you'll be a bein your whole life. Again, it's that all of that avoided, all of that self-conviction of knowing my place and identifying with this Beinani character, as we've explained many times when we study, we want to see this. It's all part of the balanced, rectified mentality of any person serving Hashem. So also a complete tzaddik thinks this way. And really, Alter Rebbe wants to guide every person in a balanced consciousness that will allow him to serve Hashem truly and fully like a complete tzaddik. And it's somewhat apparent in the order. It's not just the order of these chapters, also chapter 9, where he concludes and he phrases the balance of the two souls together. Also there, he phrases what he'll later explain as a complete tzaddik. You see that at the end, he just wants you to live right. It's not all these categorizations. This is a point we keep making because it's a very important nekuda when you study. That on one side, when you're studying, like in a laboratory, then you're severing something down into very specific different categories, and it gives a somewhat technical view of things. But at the end of the day, all these different categorizations of a tzaddik, a rasha, a beiduni, it's all theory. In life, the Alter Rebbe just wants you to live right. He wants you to live like a good Jew. And simply that would mean a complete tzaddik. In order to live correctly, you have to understand the different angles and peaks of your personality. But the understanding process is very synthetic, very technical. And the living process is very natural. And correlating the two is very important. So one of the points you'll see all the time is that in the study portion, you'll always be convinced you're the Beinoni or Halevai. Maybe you're even the Rasha. Mm-hmm. But when the Alter Rebbe goes back to a natural description of life, and he describes you mamash like a tzaddik. Everybody should be a tzaddik. So it's the point to keep going. So this is one of the points where you can see that the order of the soul that he says is the order of a tzaddik. There's the essence of the animal soul, but then he immediately forgets it and dives into the godly soul and the attributes of the godly soul and the garments of the godly soul. And only at the very end, he goes back and says that the same thing you have in the animal soul. But he doesn't even give the time of day. It's negligible. So that was another point we wanted to make. So we'll start reading now inside the chapter after we said these few introductions. With again, the main point of introduction is what we spoke about last class, which is that he's describing the essence of the animal soul. This is the point to be made, that the essence of the animal soul is just a person's sense of being, is isness, yeshus, the ego. What's called the ego is the yeshus. So we'll read it inside. So he says, Ach bi'ur ha'inyan. So we'll start explaining the depth of the topic in order to answer the questions we asked. Al pi ma shekatav Reb Chaim Vital Zal, B'shar HaKedusha u'Ba'etz Chaim. So these are two places in the Arizal's writings where he writes. Reb Chaim Vital is the one writing the Arizal's writings. And what does he write there? He writes, Shelekol ish Yisrael echad tzadik ve'echad rasha yesh shtei neshamot. That every Jew in the world has two neshamot. And he learns this, I think we mentioned this, he learns this from a verse. The verse says, V'neshamot ani asiti. It's a verse in Eov.
Yeshayahu.
I remember, no, from Yeshayahu. If I'm not mistaken, the whole verse says, Ruach lefanai ya'atof, v'neshamot ani asiti. And if I recall correctly, then the learning, the diuk, is that it starts in a plural tense, or it starts in a singular tense. Ruach lefanai ya'atof. Ruach is like a spirit. A spirit means like a personality, like a person. So each spirit, Hashem says, each person is neshamot ani asiti. Each one who passes by me like two souls. So each spirit is equivalent or concocted of two souls. That's how the verse is learned. From the change of tenses, from singular tense to plural tense. Ruach lefanai ya'atof, v'neshamot ani asiti. So from that, the Arizal, or Chaim Vital, he learns into that verse the source of what's explained in Kabbalah, that every Jew has two souls. שתי נשמות, וכדכתיב נשמות אני עשיתי, שהן שתי נפשות, נפש אחת, מצד הקליפה וסטרא אחרא. One nefesh, one of these neshamas, is from klipa, like we started saying, that he starts with the animal soul. מצד הקליפה וסטרא אחרא. והיא מתלבשת בדם האדם להחיות הגוף. And this soul, it exists or dwells in a person's blood and vitalizes the body. Like the Torah says, that the soul, the vitality of the body, of the flesh, is in the blood. Now, from this soul, like we said again, the essence of the soul is only its being part of Klipa v'Sitra. That the animal soul is part of the Klipa, as explained in Kabbalah. So again, there's definitely a lot of background assumed here. The background the Alter Rebbe is assuming is that the phrase Sitra Achra or Klipa means something to you. And it probably does. It probably means something to everybody here. But that's very basic. He's assuming that you understand the simple categorization in Kabbalah between Kedusha and Klipa. And saying that the animal soul is coming from Klipa is saying that he said it all. That does it mean that you have a soul from Klipa? Is that your personality is an experience of selfness, an experience in concealing Hashem's unity. That's what it means that Hashem created a Klipa. Klipa is a shell. The Klipa of reality is what Hashem created reality in a way that its true existence as part of Hashem is concealed or like a shell. It's tavua. It's drowned. The word for teva is tavua, which means like embodied. Take something and drown it, sink it. So Hashem, the true nature of reality, is sunken within the reality itself. This is the meaning of the word teva, nature. That there's any artifact, Hashem creates reality, and the true nature of reality, as we studied in Shari Yachud Ve'emunah, could very well be that when the Alter Rebbe assumes your background, other than assuming that you're familiar with these terms from other books in Judaism, it could very well be that he's also leaning on Shari Yachud Ve'emunah, which, as we know, he wrote earlier. So we also, not so long ago, studied Shari Yachud Ve'emunah. The terms I'm using here are quoting from there. There he says that what is Midat HaGvura? HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Gvura is what he conceals the nature of reality within the reality itself. So that every creation, instead of presenting its creator, expressing that it's only part of its creator, as we explained this at length, that every creation is like an action, it's a doing, an asiyah, it's a deed of Hashem, ma'aseh Hashem. And just like my deeds are nothing but myself, and there's no reality but myself, but Kadosh Baruch Hu, he does things in a way that it's not apparent that there's a doer doing them, that they're just doings. The doer conceals himself within his doings. And the word for that is nature, as he explains in chapter 6 in Shari Yachud Ve'emunah. So again, so that's klipa. That's the essence of klipa, and our animal soul is coming from there, is stemming from there. So that's the essence of our experience of self. We experience our being just as an existing fact.
But can I ask a question before you go? Where did you get spirit in the beginning? Spirit has two souls. So
Spirit,
what?
The beginning of the verse, he doesn't quote the whole verse. He only quotes the plural, the second half of the verse. And if you look up that verse, Neshamot Ani Asiti, what he's quoting here, he quoted the words from which the Arizal learns there are two souls.
It's Yeshaya chapter 57, line 16.
Okay, so if you look that up,
I'm not going to look it up. Tell me, please.
then you'll see that the beginning of the verse starts with, it says, Ruach lefanai yator, that a spirit, I don't know how they translate that, yatof, the spirit passes by me, I don't know exactly how that's translated, that each spirit, as in, a spirit is like a neshama, or again, I don't want to use the word neshama because the word neshama is used in the second half of the verse. But every spirit is like a personality, a person. So every spirit, the neshamot aniyasiti, has two souls. So every spirit is referred to as two souls that Hashem created. Ruach lefanayatov v'neshamot aniyasiti. Each spirit comes by me, and I created two souls. So you see that every spirit is referred to as two souls. He doesn't quote the spirit part. He only quotes the soul part. But the beginning of that verse says spirit in singular tense. And that's how the Arizal learns from that verse that every one spirit has two souls. Let's say that. So that again, so that's, as we said, the core essence of the animal soul. But from that, just from the existential sense of being myself, from that comes all of my bad. That's what he says here. Ki nefesh habasar badami, umimena baot. From that soul come kol hamidot haraot. So the midot haraot, that's already much more similar to what we'd call an evil inclination, like a yetzer hara. Midot haraot is already something more typically bad, not just existentially bad. Like if we want to, like we said, the core of understanding here in all of the book is that once I explain Kedusha and Klipa, so I substitute the phrases good and bad for Kedusha and Klipa. But now you see that within the areas of Kedusha and Klipa, there's also such a thing as good and bad. So the first time he says bad, he didn't say the animal soul is bad. He just says it's Klipa. Now, you could say that means like the animal soul isn't bad. Much more precisely to say that Klipa is much worse than bad. It's much more correct to see things that way. Bad is just a result of the core of evil. The core of evil is just Klipa, which means, again, just concealing Hashem, like an untrue reality, a dishonest reality, the lie of creation. That I experience myself as being like an independent reality, not dependent on any creator. That's the core of bad. But he doesn't call that bad. He just says that all bad comes from that. Now, why doesn't he call that bad? Because simply, Klipa, you can't call it bad because HaKadosh Baruch Hu created it. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Be'emet, like we learned in Sha'arichut Emunah, he created a creation that doesn't experience its source, that experiences itself. Again, that the creating, the doing is, like we said, embodied within the creation. So the doer is concealed within us. So this is the way Hashem created us. It's not bad in of itself, on one hand, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu Be'emet, as we'll see, he really wants a finite reality. I mean, the essence of finitude is a result of HaKadosh Baruch Hu concealing himself from creation, that there can be materialism and finite creations, well-defined finite creations because of this concealment. So that's not bad in of itself. But because of that nature of our reality, from that come all of our bad traits. And so all of our bad stems from our existential experience of self as being separate from our sources. So that's the case, like the factual fact that we are created, we're existed in a way that we feel, that we don't feel that we're being existed. We just feel existing. The fact isn't a bad thing. That's how Hashem created us. But it's the source that all of evil stems from. Now, so in a way, again, we can read this in two different ways. You could say that he doesn't call the animal soul bad, or you could say that klipa is much worse than bad. It's the source of all bad. And what does he call bad? He calls midot ra'ot. Now, this is not so complicated to understand. That all of a person's bad traits, all of his, like you say, that they are his egocentric traits, that is, they evolve, they all stem from his over involvement in self, because of his existential experience of his self-centered feeling of self. That he has no root. I don't feel that I have anything creating me. I'm just in of myself. That I feel myself from myself, stemming and beginning from myself. That's the center of my creation. It's called being self-centered. Not that myself is my center. That's where all of my bad traits stem from. So now he'll start counting bad traits, but as we'll see, each one of these bad traits, it's just an expression or an elaboration of the existential experience of isness. Okay, so the simplest example, actually, the first example he brings is already a little bit surprising. What would I have thought would be the simplest example for a bad trait? Anybody who's been studying Chabad for a while. So typically, I think that pride would be the first thing he'd say, ga'ava. So anybody who learns Chassidus knows that ga'ava is the worst thing. Why? Because again, ga'ava is klipa, it's sense of self. But he doesn't start with ga'ava. What does he start with? Let's read it inside. Again, so mimena, from this animal soul, ba'ot, come, kol midot ha'ra'ot, all of the bad, all the evil inclinations, all of the bad midot. Me'arba yesot ra'im sheba, from the four elements that conjure the soul. Dehainu, for instance, kas ve'ga'ava mi'yisodei. The first bad attribute he mentions before he mentions pride. The first one he mentions is kas. Yeah, what's the question?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yes. So what's the connection between what's known as low self-esteem and gaiva? They both seem self-centered. Is there any difference between them?
Okay, so I mean, simply low self-esteem is sadness. Like the last, he'll mention now four elements. Each element
okay,
will
interesting.
explain different attributes. The last one he'll mention, very important, the order, very, very important. The first one he mentions is anger. The last one he'll mention is the element of earth. And from the element of earth, he'll say that from earth come laziness, first of all, and sadness, like heaviness. Earth is like your mass. So all of your bad, heavy attribute, what's called a down, all your downs come from earth, from the element of earth. So simply, if you ask what low self-esteem is, that's the heavy part of your self-esteem. But it's the same, again, it's very, very similar to your high self-esteem. Like, pride is the high of your self-esteem. That's like fire, it rises. And that's why it comes from the element of fire. And sadness or depression or anguish or all those other low self-esteem experiences, those are the lows of your self-esteem. But again, like we're stressing here every time, experiencing your self-esteem, that's klipa. So if it's in a high or in a low, that's already what comes of it. Now, why anyway is pride much not so clear what's worse, as we'll see in the entire book. Simply, I'd say pride is the worst. But if you study Chassidus a bit, then you know that also sadness is very bad. Like, we don't like sadness on the one hand, but on the other hand, sadness is what to do with it. We've discussed this many times. Sadness is something that's rectifiable. So of these four elements, the last one he mentions is earth. Why? Because the element of earth is fixable. Again, the element of earth is the most essential. It's like the mass of your animal soul, like the actual existence. All the other elements, it is very, very important. Ma'amarim and Chassidut, usually around the topic of the red heifer, hara aduma. That in the red heifer, you need to burn the animal down. You take the cow and you burn it, and you only use the earth, the element of earth. In the other three elements, which are actually all of the image of the cow, all of the volume of the cow disintegrates in the fire, and what's left is only the mass, the critical mass. The efer is the critical mass, and that part can be used for kedusha. The same thing in the animal soul. The attributes of earth, the sadness, the downs can be elevated to kedusha, whereas the attributes of fire, air, and water need to be relatively eradicated, as we'll see. But still, again, the first point to be mentioned is that before he mentions pride, even, the first thing he mentions is kas. Kas is anger. So why is that the case? So first of all, because when he says pride here, as we've noted already, he's not talking about Yeshus. Because we already said that Yeshus, like just the core experience of being, that he doesn't even call that bad. He just calls that nefesh behemit. And that is the essence of the animal soul, the existence, the experience of being, Yeshus, the core of the ego. In other places in Chassidus, this could be called pride very often. Like this minuscule differentiation we're making between a person's sense of self and a person's image of self. So that's not always differentiated. But here, because we're studying it precisely, then we want to make this point, that there's a difference between your existential self of sense of being, which is the core of your animal soul, and the image of self, which is a much more elaborate image you have about who you are. So the core of existence, he calls the essence of the animal soul. That's Yeshus. And when he says pride, he says pride is already a midah. It's already an inclination, what you're inclined to make a fuss of your existence. What you fuss over yourself is your pride. The core of being, he doesn't call that pride here. He just calls that klipa. If you were to, so why am I stressing this point? Because the core of existence, Yeshus, definitely would precede anger or any other attribute. It's the core of being. But the first, now once I make that differentiation, once I differentiate between the core of existence and pride, then anger precedes pride. Like the first bad attribute you feel is anger. So this needs a bit of explanation. Before you're proud, the word for this in Hebrew usually is makpid. Before you're proud, you're how would I say that in English? Probably there's a better word. It's not coming to mind. But what comes to mind is that the first trait coming from your core of existence is just a lack of tolerance. You lack tolerance. The spark of anger is a lack of tolerance. Lakpid. How do you say lakpid in English?
Makpid, isn't it to be careful about something?
So it could be to be careful, nachon. It could be used that way, but it could also be used to say that I'm makpid on you.
Frustrated?
It's not frustrated. It's again, it's like I don't tolerate you. I'm angry, but it's not a heartful angry. It's like a mindful anger, where you feel that you're like I have I have it in for you. You
Is it a lack of? Is it a lack,
what's that?
is it a lack of patience?
A lack of tolerance, yeah, a lack of patience. But it's an active lack of patience. It's like I see you doing something bad, not even to me, but I think to myself, oh, you're a bad person. I just like you, I makpid. It's called lahakpid. Lahakpid. Maybe I'll Google it since we're on Zoom. So
Resentment?
I'm on top of you mentally, like I'm.
There's a condescendingness to it. Right? Let's see what morphics
Translate. I'm also not strict.
Strict. Nah. It could mean if a person is makpid, so he's very strict. But
Any other choices? Well, meticulous, pedantic. Oh, that's a negative one. Pedantic.
Yeah. I guess they don't have there's no.
Punctilious is negative. Severe. Painstaking.
To be punctilious. I don't know that word. What's punctilious?
It
seems to have that negative strictness, a negative.
What about meticulous?
Meticulous, right? It's meticulous in a negative sense.
Mustar?
What is this?
You're being judgmental. It's judgmental.
Very important. It's judgmental. No, that's the nearest word I'd use. But what it's implying, again, is just a lack of tolerance to another existence. That I don't tolerate your existence. You seem intolerable to me. Why do I want to mention this? Because just the core experience of existence of kilo that I take up some space, it immediately makes me non-tolerable to you, because you also take up space. We're competing on the same space. So even if you live in China, but hypothetically, we're competing over the same space. Like it says in Chassidus, you could be sitting in an empty room, like you're waiting for the doctor or something, and you're in a room, the waiting room, it's completely empty. And you're sitting there for 10 minutes, and suddenly someone walks in, and you get this feeling that he kind of imposed on you. Again, now you'd be embarrassed to even say that because it's so ridiculous, but somewhere inside you feel that way. You feel that this person is imposing. It's called lahakpid. That's very gentle. It could be worse than that. And this is the core that comes from your animal soul. It comes from the essence of existing, the existential sense of being. Let's say that's anger. It precedes pride. And pride, like conventional pride, not just existential pride, which precedes everything, but what he calls pride here, which is like making a whole big fuss over myself, that comes after that. But in your mind, first, you makpid, you get angry at people. People seem intolerable to you. That comes from your sense of taking up space. You feel that you're something. Just by being something, other somethings interfere with your existence, and you're angry at them. You have a kaped on them. So this is mamash, the worst trait of the animal soul. This is the core of evil. This trait here, and very, very typical of the human race. So we all need to be very aware that this sensation of, like, again, existential lack of tolerance is the first spark of my animal soul. The first expression of bad from my animal soul.